It's such a gorgeous place to be, isn't it? Your garden is wonderful. What brought you here?
I'd always wanted to move to the countryside. I grew up in Hastings and then went to London in my early 20s and have always missed being near the coast and near the countryside. Once you're in London, it's very hard to leave, and we had a family there, and I had a job there. I started off as a social worker in mental health, and then after I'd had children, I trained as a counsellor, and then the last 5 years in London, before I came down here, I was working at a London hospital, working with parents of children who were patients at the hospital. So I was working with parents whose children were very sick and parents whose children had died as a parent counsellor there. Yeah. So, you know, it was time to leave. It was time to move to the countryside. I've been here for 4 years now, and it's been really interesting because I found when I first came down here that although I'd finished my job, I was still thinking about it. So I couldn't forget about the families. They were in my mind a lot of the time. So I thought, I'm going to have to start writing down some of these conversations that I had with the families. Parents whose children die have a great investment in continuing to grieve. They see that any diminution of their grief is somehow a diminution of their love for their child, and rather than have a talk about grieving in terms of moving on, what they find most helpful is how can they continue, now that their child has died, to make their child's life relevant and meaningful in the life that they're living now. So it's not that they deny that their child has died or that they have some kind of belief in the afterlife. Some parents do, some parents don't, but more that their ongoing life as parents, still as parents of this child who has died, reflects and honours the child's life, and in that way the child's life continues to have meaning.
As a kind of therapy for yourself, as well as working things through.
I was writing about the conversations, and then that inspired me to read a bit more about parental bereavement, although I'd obviously read it while I was working, but return, I think, to some of the books that I had read and write notes from that. And as I carried on writing, I thought, you know, there's maybe going to be an article in here for a journal or something about what it's like to work with bereaved parents. But it just grew and grew over time. As I started writing, I remembered more, so it kind of grew in that way. Eventually I showed what I've been writing to a couple of people, my husband and someone else, and they were really, really positive and encouraging, and they said, you know, you should try and see if anyone would publish it. So I sent it to Jessica Kingsley, who were the leading publisher in this kind of field. And I was amazed because they said they would publish it. And
so this has all germinated from those days, and still feeling the need that you could offer something out there to the world of people who needed to become better counsellors. Or
I'm hoping the book is going to be really helpful for bereaved parents, being able to read about other parents' stories, and perhaps helping them to feel less alone, helping them perhaps also to find different ways of thinking about their own experiences through the words of others. But it's also a book for other professionals working in the field. I think especially for people who are likely to encounter bereaved parents in the course of their work, and who need to read a book, who find it helpful to read a book that isn't heavily theoretical, but is memorable. So I'm thinking about people like teachers, GPs, health visitors, of course people who work with children in hospitals and hospices, faith leaders. All these people are going to be coming across and working with bereaved parents, and I hope and feel sure that this book will be something that will really help them to enter into a little bit of the bereaved parents' experience. One of the things that I was always so moved by was this huge resilience and creative energy that parents would have after their child had died, and how so many would pour all of this energy into starting up or supporting a charity, often that was connected with the reason why their child had died, really as a way of honouring their child's life, of somehow making a small life continue to have significance and relevance. And I see this energy as a very powerful expression of their continuing bond. Sometimes parents would also change the direction of their own lives after they'd lost a child. So a mum who had lost a child who was deaf trained in signing and then worked as a signer, and through that not only was helping other people, but was also feeling connected with the child she'd lost. Whenever she was signing, she was remembering the child she'd lost. Another mum whose little one had Down syndrome and who died, retrained and became a teacher for children with special needs. And again, through that kind of work, her future took a new direction, but it also connected her back with the little girl that she'd lost. And that's what I hope that my book will convey, really, is something of the positivity that can come out of something that can feel so desperate, so pointless, so meaningless. Out of that can create something that has meaning for those who are suffering. Yeah. I think academic theory is really important, actually, but it's not me.
Okay.
So,
yes.
it's not me. And there've been some really some really important theoretical books written about bereavement, and times have been changing with them a bit as well. When people first started to write about bereavement and about how it is for someone to grieve, someone who's lost a loved one, they would write very much in terms of bereavement being a kind of journey with some sort of a resolution at the end. The resolution perhaps being something around being able to internalize the lost person, to have that person living inside, and in a way not feeling so bereft and so anguished by the loss.
Yes.
And to reach that point, the bereaved person would go through a series of tasks or stages in their grief: anger, distress, depression, denial, all these, and eventually, find some resolution. But what was interesting is that more recently, writers have been thinking that this really doesn't apply to parental bereavement, to parents who've lost a child, because they have a huge investment in continuing to grieve.
When bereaved parents came to you for counselling, Kathy, did you find that they would talk specifically about the continuing relationship with their child?
I think that when I look back on the conversations, that is in essence what they were all about. Now, how parents created their continuing bonds, what was important to them, what was helpful to them, how they expressed them, how they perceived them, that was all very, very different. But when I really looked at what they were saying, it was all about how am I going to continue living my life in any way that has meaning, in a way that also I remember the child who I've loved and lost. How can I bring that child into my life moving on from now, even though my child has died? I think that the continuing bonds are as meaningful and as enduring, whatever the circumstances. but the way that the bonds were formed, what helped parents to build and nurture and create these bonds did vary, and I write about that in quite some detail. I mean, I remember being very struck that I would see parents for counselling if their child had been stillborn, or if their child had died, say at the age of 9 or 10, they would probably be coming for counselling for the same length of time. It didn't seem to make any difference to how much of a story there was to tell, how much of a loss there was to grieve and to share. But of course, the stories would nonetheless be very, very different. It's never straightforward, absolutely right. And certainly for parents at the very beginning of their bereavement, when they have to make a transition from having a relationship with a living, breathing child who they have full responsibility for, to a child who has died, is a huge, huge challenge for all parents. Some parents, I think, also struggle more than others with creating a bond that is helpful and sustaining. Sometimes when there's a lot of anger, sometimes when there's guilt, sometimes when the bond has perhaps with the child has been a bit tricky in the first place, sometimes when people have had difficult childhoods of their own, their bond with their children is more of a struggle. So yeah, for some parents there are particular challenges, and I write about that. But for all parents who've lost a child, there are challenges along the way always as well. Yeah, and times when the bond doesn't feel as strong and as easy as it does at other times. The publishers, Jessica Kingsley, have designed a beautiful cover for my book, which is a patchwork, and this really reflects, I think, what the book is about. It's a patchwork of stories, each section telling a different story, but the whole also reflecting something about the collective experience of the parents that I write about. The title, Bereaved Parents and Their Continuing Bonds, Love After Death. I think the 3 words, love after death, really summarises everything that I want to express in the writing, that parents' love for their children continues way, way beyond death and on into the parents' lives in a future where their child is no longer with them.